Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for the second in this semester's series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute Friday morning series that gives Duke faculty in the Humanities, Interpretive Social Sciences and the Arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, allows you, the audience, to get to know our faculty. There is no agenda or theme indicated in the series, just to present work that faculty are doing that most excites them at this time. While I regret that we can't meet over breakfast and provide you with the forms of hospitality to which I hope you've become accustomed at the Humanities Institute, I am delighted that we're able to include in this format colleagues and interested publics from near and far, in addition to those who have access to our programs. On the website of the Franklin Humanities Institute, you can find recordings of past TGI FHIs, and eventually you'll also be able to find an interview with Paul in which he will describe his work. This morning, I'm very pleased to introduce Paul Jaskot, who is Professor in and Chair of Art History and Visual Studies here at Duke. He teaches courses on architectural history, modern architecture, urban planning, the digital humanities, German art, and his focus is particularly on National Socialist Germany. Jaskot is also the director of the Wired Lab for Digital Art History and Visual Culture at Duke. As I said, his scholarly work focuses on the political history of Nazi art and architecture, as well as its post-war cultural impact. And his books include The Architecture of Oppression, the SS, Forced Labor, and the Nazi Monumental Building Economy from 2000, and The Nazi Perpetrator, Post-War German Art and the Politics of the Right from 2012. He's co-edited Beyond Berlin, 12 German Cities Confront the Nazi Past, as well as New Approaches to an Integrated History of the Holocaust, Social History Representation Theory. In addition, for the past decade, he's been a member of the Holocaust Geography Collaborative, exploring the use of GIS and other digital methods to analyze the spatial history of the Holocaust. Now, Paul's first monograph, The Architecture of Oppression, analyzes through a distinctive angle the connections between architecture, Nazi party policy, and the SS's concentration camp systems of hard labor. While studies of Nazi and fascist architecture have often centered on the particular aesthetics, for example, clean lines, minimalism, classical references, etc., Paul focuses specifically on stone, literally the making of the stone into architectural matter. He shows how quarrying of stone allowed the SS to simultaneously carry out its central ideological mission while also expanding its economic position, taking advantage of market imbalances to meet the new high demand for architectural stone, with the punishment of hard labor seen as the means for increasing productivity. Paul makes a detailed argument for seeing, quote, the architectural history of National Socialist Germany not so much as a history of design, but rather as one of production. And in the 3 chapters of the book, he does an analysis of party rally grounds at Nuremberg, the plans for rebuilding Berlin, and SS institutional architecture. His second monograph, The Nazi Perpetrator, asked how did the spectre of an unrepentant, unacknowledged, and unseen Nazi perpetrator shadow the art and architecture of West Germany. He, in the process of making his argument, he looks at the notion of the perpetrator, him or herself, who was a figure whose very definition was the subject of intense political and social debate, of course, in the decades that intervened between the Nuremberg International Military Tribunals and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Hannah Arendt's idea, for example, of the banality of evil, generalized in some ways the notion of perpetrator to a large population through her reading of the Eichmann trial in the New Yorker. And Paul likewise has looked at the way in which what he calls a mostly unacknowledged a mostly unacknowledged subject in art history. He writes, the Nazi perpetrator aimed to redress this lack of through a focus on painting and architecture, and he looks particularly at the family portraits of Gerhard Richter from the 1960s, the allegorical paintings of Anselm Kiefer from the early 1980s, and the way in which they worked with the memory politics advocated by Helmut Kohl, the fate of Daniel Liebeskind's Jewish Museum in Berlin before and after the fall of the wall, and the functional repurposing of the Nuremberg Party rally grounds as part of a steady effort to lay the perpetrator to rest in the nation's historical past, as he puts it. Paul has written extensively and published widely in all the most important journals of his fields. He's received numerous grants, and he's written also on the digital humanities with colleagues here at Duke, as well as on political economy in a number of different venues. Today, his talk is titled Using Digital Methods to Analyze Humanities Sources, the Case of Nazi-Occupied Krakow. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Ranji. Very generous and fulsome introduction. I really appreciate that. Yes, so my thanks to Ranji, Chris, and Jennifer and the FHI, and of course, all of you for coming. Let me start by sharing my screen. All right. There we go. So yes, well, great. Well, thank you. I'll just start right in. I should say, as an art historian, we always read our papers. So I'm going to try to keep looking up so you don't have to look at the top of my head too much. So, but we'll see how this goes. As has long been recognized, space matters when thinking about the occupation of Eastern Europe by National Socialist Germany during World War II, as well as the horror of the Holocaust. Whether we are talking about the geographically expansive military drive or the barracks of the concentration camp, spatial questions and spatial evidence have always been part of our analysis. Still, spatial conditions, including those of the built environment, have generally been seen as background elements to a larger understanding of the Holocaust, except in specific times and places, such as at Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1943. However, I guess what I want to ask here is, can we see spatial questions as more central to a critical analysis of the Holocaust? Can we look at the planning and construction of the built environment as productive or even generative of genocide? These are the questions I would like to pose in my presentation. I will approach this issue with a diverse range of visual evidence that helps us to interrogate the planned and actual built environment under German occupation in Eastern Europe at different spatial and temporal scales. Drawing on Saul Friedlander's call for an integrated history of the Holocaust, the larger collaborative project of which this is a part, and you see my list of collaborators ever growing. I'm very much reliant and grateful to them on a daily basis. The larger collaborative project of which this is a part tries to see the European Jews and Germans, the individual and the systemic, the social and the political economic as relational terms. Indeed, a core claim for me is that the visual evidence of the Nazi-built environment has long demanded such an integrated analysis, given that it is precisely through the control and experience of space that policies of occupation could actualize the ideological goals of the perpetrator at the same time that they influenced the daily choices or lack thereof of lives of Jewish victims and others. Focusing on both known and new spatial sources, using analog and exploratory digital methods reveals previously obscured potential relationships between political economic structures, ideological beliefs, and social experience. I will take as my starting point the spaces of occupied Krakow to see what such a critical project might look like. And I should say in this analysis, I will be drawing on important new work by art historians Richard Nemec, Jacek Proklau, and Jana Komar, among others. And I'm particularly excited for the exhibition at the International Cultural Center in Krakow, which is opening in March, that will be exactly on the architecture of occupied Krakow. So that's really going to be an exciting opportunity and really push this debate much further forward. So let's stay tuned for that. But integration, that is the integration of perpetrator and victim testimonies as Friedlander would have it, integration isn't quite the right word for this project. Integration implies a bringing together, a synthesis, that the divergent historical experience and understanding of genocide from the perspective of perpetrator and victim does not quite justify. Rather, I want to argue for an intersecting history as a more accurate way of describing a holistic approach to the Holocaust. Intersection, in the sense I mean it here, occurs at many different levels. We have the historical intersection of the policies and lives of perpetrators with the experience and actions of victims. We have the evidentiary intersection of distinct kinds of documents, administrative documents, diaries, building plans, photographs, testimonies, etc. And we have the methodological intersection of approaching distinct kinds of historical sources and problems in differing ways. From a digital humanities perspective, this latter methodological point is quite familiar, given that digital projects often involve moving between distinct platforms, a range of visualization strategies, and shifting scales of analysis in order to explore the structured data systematically and rigorously. Indeed, given the expansive range of evidence that we think of as necessary to explain the genocide, this research demands a diversity of approaches and exploratory methods that are distinct in their focus, but also related in their synthetic goal. Interoperability, meaning the use of different platforms and digital functionalities that are nevertheless related through data structures or other means, seems a term from the digital humanities tailor-made to think through a question of an intersecting history of the Holocaust. Intersecting argues for a nexus of historical experience of perpetrator, bystander, and victim without implying collapsing distinctions of evidence and experience into an integrated whole. An intersecting history, however, does not mean merely putting historical trajectories of various actors and events side by side, such as this map comparison might imply, merely correlating their confluence. Rather, it requires points of intersection or nodes. This is where I would argue that the built environment plays a unique role, as it provides literally sites at which we can best explore such an intersecting history of the Holocaust. And further, Krakow under Nazi occupation is an exceptional case study, given that it was the only major site in which Nazi cultural ambition coincided with the extremes of racist anti-Semitic goals. That is, for example, it's the only site in which you had a master plan, such as the one on the right, but that you also had a major ghetto and a major concentration camp. There's no other location in occupied Europe that has that combination. In the following, I want to use building from elite architectural plans to urban policy, from the chaos of construction sites to the most humble vernacular structures, to explore the political and cultural dynamics of genocide. I want to work out from the physicality and history of building to get to a more systematic and systemic, comprehensive history of the Holocaust. In sum, I want to model how an attention to architecture and the built environment shows us some of the complexity of how the occupation of Krakow was planned, understood, and experienced by Nazi perpetrators and the Polish Jewish population alike. Part of my thesis is that art historians have ignored the integral role played by architects and engineers at all levels of policy and practice, just as Holocaust historians have undervalued how central the built environment was to the genocide. Working out from the buildings helps us to address these gaps and oversights. In the following, I will set the stage with 3 scenes at different spatial scales that draw from standard categories of art historical analysis of buildings. These categories are construction, design, and reception. Construction, as in the slide on the left, points us to the systemic elements of the built environment, such as allocations of materials, labor, and institutional, political, economic conditions. These elements help us think about the deeply embedded relationship of building to the scale of occupation and genocide. Secondly, design, such as the image in the middle, brings us to the scale of individual patrons, architects, and planners. With Krakow, that means looking at the goals of General-Gouverneur Hans Frank, or the architect of the ideal city plan for Krakow, Hubert Ritter, but also of how their plans intersected with Polish-Jewish experience during the occupation. And third, a focus on reception introduces the social history of specific buildings and sites. That is to say, what they meant to particular Nazi personnel or Polish Jewish citizens, like Halina Nelken, pictured here on the right. Again, the attempt is not to collapse these stories, but rather to connect them, to trace the intersection of different experiences and of building conditions at different scales of analysis. The intersecting history of the Holocaust occurred at all of these scales, but in distinct ways, analyzing the built environment through construction, design, and reception gets us to a more comprehensive understanding of that dynamic. After the outbreak of war on 1st of September 1939 and the subsequent German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1942, much of Central and Eastern Europe came under Nazi occupation, at least until 1943, when the war began to turn against Germany at the Battle of Stalingrad. As is well known, Hitler and his staff had relatively clear, broad goals for the control of this eastern territory, including, among others, maximizing food production, accumulating war-important resources like oil, politically neutralizing leadership, especially but not exclusively communist, and racial cleansing. An example of this would be the administrative goals set out for the general government, or Generalgouvernement, the occupied territories of Poland under Hans Frank, that were not incorporated into the Reich. In an order from September 15, 1939, Hitler made explicit his demand that Frank build a civil administration that would focus on mobilizing raw materials, industrial machinery, and labor for the German war effort, and that was it. And yet, while these goals were explicit, the planning and implementation often happened with a fair degree of regional variation, even competition between different models of what Hitler might want, what Ian Kershaw has described as working towards the Führer. This often left room for innovation that produced distinctive and brutal conditions for many communities who came under Nazi control. Needless to say, however, in spite of regional and personal differences, the scale of occupation and the concomitant scale of genocide necessitated patterns of policy and activity that reached across the region. Fundamental to these goals were building and spatial planning. The movement of people and resources required to sustain the war depended on the development and support of built infrastructure that also enabled the Holocaust. This meant not only constructing and maintaining such well-known examples as the railroad system, but also thousands of miles of roads, bridges, buildings, factories, troop housing, such as you see here, garages, and the entire range of vernacular structures for the military. While this vast system had many gaps and failures, it nevertheless functioned as a political economic system that allowed for the occupation of military successes. So too did such a network of construction allow for the murder of European Jews, which became systematic in 1941-42, at the height of occupational planning. In this context, it made sense that when the chief of Nazi construction activity, the engineer Fritz Todt, died in a plane crash in February 1942, he should be replaced by an architect and urban planner, Albert Speer, you see on the left. Todt led the office of the Organisation Todt that controlled state-prioritized construction in the 1930s and into the war, as well as the Ministry of Armaments. Now, while the choice of Speer to replace him as the Minister of Armaments might at first appear odd, given that these positions did not require any real design skills, they nevertheless did require the kind of project management of materials, labor, and transportation at a vast scale that a man like Speer would have because of his oversight of the massive urban redesign of the city of Berlin. Architectural experience mattered in that it trained Speer to plan, organize, and implement policies concerning the built environment at the scale that made the war and genocide productive. Indeed, when Speer took office in 1942, he immediately moved to centralize all building in the occupied territories under his ministry. He brushed aside what he viewed as the regional incompetence, even of officials as high as Hans Frank, and made the use of steel and cement, building labor, and prioritization of construction work a central component of the occupation's success. But design was also not forgotten in this infrastructure of occupation. The German war drive always had not only political economic objectives, but also cultural ones. And we often forget that, I think, in the literature. Cultural ones that depended on the racist exclusion of Jews and then Slavs from a successfully Germanified East. This process, too, showed the push and pull of regional variation at the same time that there appeared system-wide patterns. Richard Nemec, in his magisterial recent book on Nazi planning in Central Europe, has argued for the importance of this dynamic between center and periphery. For example, by December of 1939, Prague, under SS security head Reinhard Heydrich, already had a planning commission led by architect Reinhold Niemeyer. Niemeyer's commission had many connections to Speer's office of the Inspector General building in Berlin, and Heydrich, as patron and the number 2 man in the SS under Himmler, had strong goals of Germanizing the Czech protectorate. Yet the racist and colonial project, marked by the Germanified planning axes and monumental building typical of so-called Hitler cities, you see an example of that here, also reflected local initiatives and Czech participation, for example, in prioritizing housing. This center-periphery dynamic allowed for both the transmission of architectural conventions as well as the coordination of political economic concerns. In real time, architectural, military, and genocidal policies were linked most clearly in the vast policies and practices that governed the construction industry. Here we can see at the continental scale how perpetrator goals intersected with Jewish and other victim experience. Further, the broader role of building at the level of construction is clearly much more central to the intersection of the military economic drive with the oppression of the Jews than has previously been suggested by scholars. Conversely, the role of civilian or conscripted building and construction personnel, including architects, in perpetrating the horrors of the Holocaust is under-investigated. We are only just now beginning to see, literally, the built environment and construction as a central aspect of planning and enacting the Holocaust, as well as its broader political and ideological significance to perpetrators and victims. Digital methods help us to visualize the forced labor of thousands of Jews written out of our historical accounts that focus on the perpetrator perspective, especially of armaments production. Let's look at a series of exploratory draft maps of the systemic impact of construction on ghettoization, which of course includes Krakow. Our scholarly collaborative has recently produced these to help us examine this issue more critically. And here I want to acknowledge the leadership of Ann Knowles, as well as the significant contributions to my thought by Annika Walke, Yves Duffy, Antonio Lopiano, Justus Hildebrandt, and others. We have developed data extraction standards to mine the evidence in the US Holocaust Memorial Museum's Encyclopedia of the Camps and Ghettos. As with any database project like this, you immediately encounter very humanistic problems, such as discovering a much clearer picture of the bias in your sources. And I can't emphasize that enough for the humanists that have not done digital work, how much this work actually tells you more about your sources, perhaps in a way that is the reverse of what we usually think of digital humanities. These two maps, for example, show every ghetto site with 2 factors highlighted. First, a simple illustration of the average number of pages for each entry in the encyclopedia. That is to say, the amount of evidence we had to work with. You can see instantly a clear bias towards the Generalgouvernement, the darker shaded region on the left, in central Poland. And second, when looking at labor, you see that there are relatively few ghettos highlighted for which we know with certainty the exact extent of forced labor activities. What that means is that we have had to interpret the evidence the best we can by developing consistent and rigorous standards in order to evaluate the questions of labor patterns across the system. It's important to realize, I think, that constructing historical databases is as humanistic in this regard as interpreting perpetrator documents or survivor testimony. In general, when scholars talk about forced labor in the ghetto system, they talk almost always about three things: the random and abusive labor imposed by Nazi officials, such as snow removal; the workshop or manufacturing work of firms located in or near the ghettos, especially for the war effort, such as Schindler's factory being a famous example; or agricultural work to sustain the German military occupation. These categories are indeed very important, part of the ghetto system as a whole, and relatively evenly distributed across the system. But the scholarship does not prepare us for this other map. Construction forced labor was much more prevalent than all other types of labor for Jews in the ghetto system, all other types. Furthermore, while it is present in Eastern ghettos, it is dominant in the ghettos of Central Europe, above all the General Gouvernement. While this may reflect, of course, the bias that we've already talked about in the evidence of the encyclopedia, the map raises a question, nevertheless, about what role construction might have played in the daily lives of Jews under occupation, as well as its importance to the occupiers, especially Frank and his General Gouvernement. But these maps are not only about policy decisions, they're also about experience, that is, they are intersectional. By mapping labor in this way, we have moved from the standard model of asking what the perpetrators wanted the labor for and who the patrons were, Schindler, Siemens, Krupps, or whomever. And instead, we are highlighting the experience of victims by extracting and mapping the actual experience of their oppression. We could easily do a map of Siemens or Krupps, and there's certainly no reason that some of these sites of construction would not have been for those clients. Indeed, Siemens had a building construction forced labor site outside of Krakow. By mapping construction, however, we pose the question of how economic decisions supporting the war effort intersected with Jewish forced labor experience, the carrying of bricks, the digging of trenches, the carrying of bags of cement, and how these Jewish experiences were across the ghetto system. The map does not answer that question of why, but rather it acts as a nodal point, a visualization that points to both perpetrator policies of establishing ghettos and Jewish experience of construction forced labor. It allows us to say that construction forced labor was a systemic part of ghettoization. Now, the immense continental scale of building ambition played out, of course, at the regional and local level in terms of concrete planning and practices that propelled the dual goals of strengthening the military political economy and the Germanic racialization of the East. These intersecting trajectories became much more apparent when we focus in on the scale of Distrikt Krakow, which you see here, the Nazi administrative unit that encompassed the city and much of surrounding Galicia. This area contained ultimately 71 ghettos, which you see the squares there, of which the Krakow ghetto was, of course, the most prominent. By shifting from our emphasis on the construction industry systemically to another category of architectural analysis, that of design, we can examine how the ideological driven drive towards Germanification entailed an intersection of perpetrator goals and victim experience. That Frank saw the built environment as important for his political goals was clear almost from the beginning of his regime. For him, building served an ideological, political, and practical role. Ideologically, the return of Krakow corresponded to Frank's decision to locate his government and personal residence in the medieval and early modern castle of the Wawel, which you see here. It should be noted that even the name of the Wawel itself was consistently Germanified and recast as Burg or castle in General Gouvernement documents to remove any association with its Polish past. The site dominated the city, and the Wawel as a stage set certainly played the propaganda role of asserting Nazi dominance. But the takeover of the castle also corresponded to the special status of the Generalgouvernement within Nazi policy, where here the desire for appropriating pre-modern, particularly imperial models were explicit. Because the territory was deemed racially and economically inferior, from Hitler's perspective, it was not to be incorporated into Germany, but rather was meant to be an older form of colony, ruthlessly exploited for its resources and for its Jewish and non-Jewish labor. As with using the name of the Burg, so too was colony a specific designation in memorandum, that is the word they used. Both cemented the racial hierarchy that enabled the Nazi ruling class. Importantly for Frank and his administration, however, was that his empire was not something they could just take over, but rather was something that had to be designed and implemented. Organizing space and planning buildings had short-term and long-term significance. Frank, famous for his cultural interests in the symphony and art, was equally concerned with the ideological and political role of building for Krakow in particular, as Polish art historian Jacek Purklau has made clear in his many writings on this topic. For example, in a May 1940 meeting with his main architectural advisor, Richard Rattinger, and architect Horstmann, concerning a modern hotel in the city they wanted to build, the topic of conversation also focused on preserving the historical core around the Wawel. The rest of the city, however, so outside of that historical core, was up for a total redesign from their perspective. By October of 1940, the Nazi-appointed mayor of the city, Karl Schmidt, could state that planning goals currently included 65 buildings and 300 apartments already renovated or completed, as well as an additional 180 houses and 1,000 apartments planned. This was nowhere near sufficient for the eventual 30,000 Germans and their families that were to move into the city, but it was an impressive start. Indeed, by a January 1941 meeting, Frank's Oberbaurat Stutznacher worried that the current building campaign was so ambitious that it may be in conflict with the immediate resources needed for the war effort. That is, cultural and military ambitions were planned simultaneously. This did not, however, stop Frank from his dreams of a Germanified Krakow going forward. Crucial for Frank during his entire period of rule was the central symbolic and administrative importance of the Wawel. As has been well documented, Frank saw the Nazi occupation of the Wawel as a sign of the imperial return of Germany to Central Europe. Indeed, Goebbels referred to him in his diary as setting himself up as King of Poland. He always called the building the Burg or castle, as he was the Burgherr, and there was a Burg chancellery, and there was even a Burg publishing house. And when he was present, like a king, the Nazi flag would be raised at the highest tower. The Wawel itself was a building site up through 1944, when the administrative addition that you see here and garage complex was finally finished, completed in the stoic, plaster-walled, stone-detailed vernacular style of many Nazi administrative buildings. Even in January of 1945, with the Russian army at his door, Frank took one last tour of the public and residential rooms as his final act. The building served as an administrative center, but also as an ideological focus to Germanification, as well as a residence that allowed Frank and his wife Brigitta to project an imperial cultural presence within the Generalgouvernement. At the moment of 1940-41, these ideological and administrative ambitions were at their height and most effective. It is thus not surprising that in that period, Krakow also became what was called a Hitler city, with its own major redesign plan following others, including Munich, Nuremberg, Berlin, and Hamburg and others. Notably, the list decidedly did not include Warsaw, which was much too Polish identified as a city for these plans. For this task, Speer apparently appointed the Leipzig architect Hubert Ritter, and from 1940 through 41, Ritter developed his plan for a massive new Nazi administrative center, along with plans for housing, development of the riverfront, and transportation infrastructure, among other ideas. While we did not have time to go into the detail on Richter's plan, and here I would point you to the work of Perklau and Nemec on this topic if you are interested, I would want to highlight some of its main features by analyzing an animation of the plan that we've done. This digital work is especially helpful as it shows the incorporation not only of perpetrator values, but also planning for Jewish victim experience. In other words, and surprisingly for a relatively public Nazi design, the ideological goals of Germanifying Krakow and the suppression of the Jewish community were mutually constituting parts of the plan. In this regard, the visual material evidence, the plans, the photos, and physical building sites, allows for a digital analysis that expands on a standard close reading in order to address these spatial problems and historical questions. In this animation I'm about to show you, you will see the three distinct planning phases of the design from 1940 through 1941. Note that the plan was finished after the ghetto was opened in March 1941. As Ritter stated in his published text, quote, since with the Nazi plans, we can count on a total disappearance of the Jews, his word, we can remain calm about their present position in the city. Later, the ghetto will be torn down and a new city quarter for housing will be built, end quote. Such statements are clarified by our exploratory reconstruction. And again, what you're about to see here is three distinct phases. You're going to see them in overview, and then you're going to see a quick bunch of the 3D model. And you could see the various locations of the Wawel and the ghetto, and that was the area that was for the Nazi ideal plan. Now, our visualization of Ritter's ideal plan pushes well beyond the textual description to show other National Socialist political and ideological issues. Above all, the conceptual and spatial relationship between the German and Jewish communities at that time. Davide Contiero's reconstructions in AutoCAD are derived from the material evidence of the models and the photos. The visualization in this case raised new questions, especially as we moved the 3D model renderings into an animation. With this rendering process, the reconstructions led us to an analysis of the urban and architectural forms different from what we had expected. Working from the most developed standalone plan, as well as the published report by Ritter and the photographic models, it became much clearer how the spatial conception changed from 1940 through 1941 through three distinct phases of the plan, something not previously noted by scholars, looking just at the drawings alone. Paying attention especially to the edges of the plan, as well as the symbolic plaza at the heart of the design, we can see how the monumental buildings originally conceived as a residence and headquarters for General Governor Frank, here at the bottom of the image, receded quickly to become relatively minor structures in favor of the Wawel at the top. In addition, as the residential complex diminished in scale, the symbolic and public center of the plan as a parade ground or meeting place to stage Nazi authority increased in importance and elaboration. Still, while the plan emphasized specific state architectural preferences emanating from Speer and Berlin, such as the importance of a central plaza, it also adapted to highlighting the key local role of the Wawel as Frank's symbolic center. This building mediated between the historic core and the new Nazi city. The visual analysis prompted a more careful investigation of the sources and helped us to see the apparent administrative negotiation involved in developing the site. But also surprisingly, the spatial orientation to the Jewish ghetto, which abutted, however temporarily, the southeast corner of the Nazi district, also became more emphatic in our rendering. In this comparison you see here, we can see that the changes to where the plan adjoined the ghetto, which is in the upper right of the image, just beyond the canal there. In the initial plan, there were buildings of no striking feature. This altered in the second February 1941 plan, which you see at the top, with the position of the tower, a form that was simplified in the third May 1941 iteration, which you see below, to form one of three towers on the key corners of the Nazi district, perhaps mimicking, in a modern variation, the medieval presence and focus on the Burg with its own tower forms. But such changes made to the architectural plan also emphasized the visual and spatial proximity of the ghetto, rather than masking or obscuring it. This is shown in particular by the development of the modest skyscraper tower exactly in the southeast corner of the plan, the upper right of your image. This building established not only a profile for the Nazi ideal city, it also provided clear view sheds, both directly into the spaces of the ghetto, overseeing in particular the 19th century plaza of the Podgórze market, but where the Judenrat was located, but also from the ghetto to the spatial authority of the new Nazi capital. While this observation may have been made by further close looking to the original models, and it certainly does not replace the analog art historical methods, the digital reconstruction makes the spatial changes and relationship within the complex city scale of the plan more evident. What did it mean for the Nazi planners to emphasize the proximity to the ghetto, and what might that have meant to Polish Jews forced into the segregated space? Who would have known of this as a sign of the new Nazi regime in Krakow? Were these goals that Frank shared with architect Ritter? Or was this the architect's own idea for the political and ideological domination of the space? Were they mere symbolic forms on the model, or also meant to function as monuments of practical surveillance of the surrounding Christian and Jewish Polish community? This analysis reveals the conflicts, contradictions, and complexities of Nazi spatial planning in Krakow, and it helps us to clarify the material evidence of design that remains, as well as pointing to a more precise political questions, especially concerning short-term actions and long-term racist goals. Now, while Frank and Ritter's plans reveal how political goals and ideological ambitions connected occupation to racist spatial planning, this scale of urban design still distances us from the meaning of the built environment for individuals at particular sites. For that, we need to turn to the reception of the built environment, looking at how perpetrators and victims understood the spaces around them. These are overlapping perspectives that intersect at particular sites or around specific symbolic structures like the Wawel. We can begin to tease out these intersections by looking at the case study of housing, a building type that was, of course, a crucial concern for both the occupational policies of the Nazi elite and the Polish Jews alike. As Jacek Perklau reminds us, housing estates were just as important in interwar Poland as they were in Germany and other parts of Europe. Housing for large urban populations was crucial, and it certainly was also for Frank's administration, given the number of German officials who were moving into Krakow. With this in mind, the city building administration hired Polish architect Zbigniew Kupiec in 1940 to design a substantial housing estate of 65 residences from 3 to 5 stories in height. Built on the new Reichsstraße, as it was called, that opened a large street to the northwest in the direction to Berlin, essentially. The dwellings had plaster walls and prominent window surrounds, as you can see here. Again, a stylistic choice that would have been recognized in many a German city, but also was a relatively neutral contribution to the Polish cityscape. This settlement was near several headquarters of various occupation ministries to further establish a German geography to this part of the Polish city. Functional but familiar, the importance of such housing was marked here and elsewhere in the occupied spaces as a Nazi presence. Sections of the building site were finished and occupied by early 1941, and other residences were added on through the years. And I should say working on the housing estates continued and through 1944, although it was completed after the war itself, the whole estate. Housing, however, was not just a practical matter, but also had a particular significance to the Nazi elite, as the case of the Franks and the Wawel has made clear. This extended, though, to new construction as well. For example, Frank's regional governor for Distrikt Krakow, Otto Wächter, and his wife Charlotte, or Lotte, exemplified this. Much of their letter exchanges when they were apart in 1941, or Lotte's diary entries when they were together in Krakow, described their significant intimacy with the Franks, the constant engagements at the Wawel, but also their own concern over establishing an equally prominent house corresponding to their status as the occupying elite. They were essentially the number two couple in the area. So Otto's residence in Krakow of the Palais Potocki, renamed Altes Palais, was insufficiently grand for the couple, and they spent much of 1941 planning and beginning construction on this site on the left, a new house they called the Wartenberg. Built on a prominent hill just west of Krakow, the site had a stunning view of the Vistula, also mimicking in this regard the medieval setting of the Wawel. While the layout and site plan were by the Polish architect Adolf Szyszko-Buchusz, the exterior detailing was by two Austrians, Richard Fopp and Hans Petermayer. The prestigious structure was of great interest to Lotte, and she wrote about it consistently through 1941 in letters and in her diaries, including sketching out the practical floor plan of a washroom near the children's room, as well as discussing it over tea on site with Brigitte Frank. As an amateur photographer, albeit with some artistic training, she also documented a Sunday visit to the site under construction with her family in March of 1941. While it was not completed until after they left Krakow for a new post in Lviv in January of 1942, the house, with its stone trim, steeply hipped roof, and twin extended segments on each end as forms of towers, if you will, was a neo-medieval yet modern palace that gave the Wächters an equal presence to the Franks as the new ruling elite. And yet, what can't be ignored is that Lotte Wächter's focus on housing and her photos, that is March 1941, occurred simultaneously with her husband Otto's oversight of another major residential project, the construction of the Krakow Ghetto. Obviously and cruelly, the Jewish community had a very different understanding of the meaning of housing in these months. With the public order of March 3rd, all Krakow Jews were forced into inadequate housing in the district of Podgorze, just south of the Vistula, by March 20th. In his first idea for segregated planning, Frank had originally wanted to purge Krakow of all Jews. That is, he really wanted it to be a German city, encouraging migration to other cities in 1940. And by the way, after the Jews, the Christian Poles were to be pushed out next. Wächter, however, noted by November of 1940 to his boss that this strategy had failed and they should move towards instead a policy of ghettoization, as had already been implemented in Warsaw. In an area of Podgorze with approximately 320 mostly run-down 19th century residences, about 15,000 Jewish citizens were forced to live. By April of 1942, that number peaked at over 17,000 people. We get some insight into what the built environment meant, as well as the significance of housing, from an extraordinary diary of Helena Nelken, a young Jewish woman who would survive the Holocaust, and I might say become an art historian, would survive the Holocaust and publish the English version of her account as "And Yet I Am Here" in 1999. Nelken's diary is peppered with how the contrast of familiar spaces and the buildings of Krakow emphasized her feelings of confinement and restriction. That is, housing and building was a way of mediating her experience of what she was feeling. She made this explicit, for example, in an entry after the rare allowance of a visit beyond the ghetto walls in December of 1941. Quote, "After these excursions into town, the ghetto seems even more unbearable to me," end quote. It is the comparative built environment that Nelken emphasizes here and in other parts of the ghetto. And the comparative emphasizes particularly highlights the meaning of the oppression of her current housing situation. Her narration is punctuated by such reflections on contrasting spaces and buildings. For example, as she stated in her only other permitted trip outside of the ghetto that year, August of 1941, quote, "Papa has come down with dysentery. The apothecary in the ghetto didn't have the medicine, so I received a pass to Krakow in order to search for it in the city pharmacy. For the first time in 5 months, I left the ghetto and hurried toward our real pre-ghetto house. What an ugly quarter of Krakow the Germans selected for the Jewish ghetto. As I walked towards the Pilsudski Bridge, and looked at the fresh green foliage among the boulevards, at the streets swept clean by a summer's shower, and saw again all the places I know so well, I could hardly control my tears. I visited our street, our house, our old neighbors, and finally our own apartment. What memories and what changes. Inanimate objects are cruel in their unchanging existence. The street, the house, the garden, and some of the furniture we left behind are all exactly the same. Only I am behind bars like a dog, end quote. In other entries, her views of the Vistula and its bridges from the small hill that backs up to the ghetto are a reminder, among other landmarks, of the confinement of her family in one room of an apartment. Important to emphasize here is how Nelken's history intersects, but is of course quite distinct from that of Lotte Vector. Nelken commented upon and searched out spaces beyond her residence in the symbolic landscape of Krakow, now occupied by Vector and her Nazi associates, above all the Wawel. The building marked Nelken's spatial exclusion in 1941 and highlighted the contraction of her residential environment to a pitiful room in a rundown building. She needed to focus on the shrinking scale of her housing situation in order to survive. All the while, other spaces outside of the ghetto, like the bridge over the Vistula or the Wawel that she could see on her walks up to the Soda Hill, reminded her of how others lived, spatially and domestically, above all the Nazi elite. At the exact time Lotte Vector built up and expanded her domestic goals, including her active planning of the grandiose Palace of the Wartenberg. She too saw her power in relation to and distinct from Jewish experience in spatial and domestic terms. This is most clearly exemplified in an entry in her daybook, in which she records a pleasure trip in April 41 that she, her husband, and the Franks took to Warsaw. They visited the royal castle, destroyed by the German military drive and seen here, crossed over the famous Vistula Bridge, did some shopping, and oh yes, they also visited the ghetto. This trip is captured in her photo album, not excluding this haunting perpetrator photo of the crowded streets full of Polish Jews in the Warsaw ghetto, presumably taken from a car, as the high angle of the photograph seems to indicate. Vector saw ghettoization and the crowded residential conditions. She knew those spaces, and yet they had no relationship to her, or rather they were not integrated with her experience. She received them as part of the landscape, with the conditions of the ghetto as a sign, among other signs, of German triumph. And this photo is just one of several photos of Warsaw on this page. It's no more nor less than the other tourist shots that she took. In this regard, the photo is not about her concept of the domestic. And she certainly wasn't thinking about this when, in a letter to Otto later that year, she complained about her own living conditions, having to live in a dirty and chaotic residence, the Altes Palais in Krakow, presumably while she waits for the Wartenberg to be finished. The photo of the ghetto and its building showed ideological dominance achieved through political and military means, of which she heartily approved. It exemplified the broader system of occupation that made her freedom to plan her private spaces. These are separate, just as the thematically separate photographs of her, Otto, and the children on one page of the photo album from the tourist shots, the ski vacations, or this image of the ghettos on the other. So literally you have the tourist images on one page, you turn the page, it's domestic scenes within of the Vector family. So they're quite two separate thematically different parts of the album. But whether she separated these spaces or not visually, her conception of the domestic intersected with the conditions of housing forced onto Nelken. Indeed, they were mutually constituted. Helena Nelken's powerful story also includes her difficulties as a forced laborer, contributing to the war economy, up through her last entry dated in spring of 1943. The evidence presented here, though, also shows how her world was conditioned by the spatial segregation of Krakow and Frank that was a distinct component of the Ritter plan. Further, her entries highlight how she conceived of the built environment as one means of making sense of her experience of ghettoization. That is to say, Nelken's diary of the Holocaust, as it happened, indicates the shadow of construction, design, and reception that are central to analyzing architecture in the built environment. Her life story points us back to building as nodes that condition and shape events. Understanding these three areas allows us to work out from building to a more complex understanding of an intersecting history of the Holocaust, one in which Jewish labor and spatial experience are just as central as perpetrator planning. One final example may help us to make this point clearer. Let us focus on the beautiful artery that flows through Krakow, the Vistula River. Note, as one detail highlighted in our animation, that the straightening of the Vistula is part of Richter's plan, here represented as a seemingly neutral background decision. It was something I have to say I barely noticed on the analog plan. It was just like, oh, okay, well, they straightened the river here in order to make space for the building. You know, whatever, I just kind of passed over it. So it's something, as I say, I barely noticed, and it really came out strongly in the digital reconstruction. Straightening the river, however, that is drawing our attention to that, straightening the river related to all three areas of the analysis I've just pointed to. That is, it pointed to the broader construction industry that stretched across occupied Europe. It pointed to the redesigns for reimagining a Germanified Krakow. And it pointed to the reception of planning decisions that gave new meaning to Jewish experience of the built environment. For construction, the first, economic considerations at a vast geographic scale were very much in play. Frank had made the regularization of the Vistula from Warsaw through Krakow a key goal of Germanizing the Generalgouvernement and already a priority by May of 1940. The river regulation, as Frank put it in a speech quoted in his office diary, quote, will have an immense colonizing significance for the Germanness of the East, end quote. In architectural design, though, our second term, changing the river's edge was also needed in order to provide the geometrically regular spaces of the Nazi administration district in Richter's ideal plan. That is, in order to create the kind of squared off building urban plan, they needed to move the river. And for the Polish Jews, this was not just economics and ideological projection, but also the new reality of the massive role construction forced labor would take on in their lives. Already by the end of 1940, the Water Administration, in charge of working on the Vistula, had 410 construction sites, employing 41,950 conscripted Polish Christian workers and using 16,145 Jewish Polish forced laborers. This included at least 2 sites on the Vistula for Krakow Jewish forced laborers already by the summer of 1940, as indicated in another diary by Julius Feldman, who was in the Warsaw Ghetto, or Krakow Ghetto, excuse me, and did not survive. The plan can thus be read as an indicator of their experience. Nelken wrote fondly of crossing the river as part of the landscape of the Krakow that she had lost. At the same time, for many of her fellow Polish Jews, that landscape gained new significance as one of the most brutal of sites of suppression. As I have argued, if we don't pay attention to construction, design, and reception, we lose the intersecting character of the Holocaust. The built environment helps us to see the connections between individuals, actions, events, and conditions. In this regard, it points us to a systemic understanding of the whole history, one that makes sense together of political economy, institutional structures, individuals, and experience. Krakow in this regard is both an exceptional built environment under Nazi occupation, but also a site in which all of these issues of construction, design, and reception were actively in play and thus visible. These spaces were productive, and taking them seriously as a central component of the Holocaust means seeing cultural history and genocide as intersecting terms, not diverging ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul, for that fascinating talk. And just as a reminder to our audience, the floor is the screen is open for questions, and you can put those questions in the Q&A. And maybe just while you're thinking those through, I could start off with one, Paul. I'm interested actually in to some extent in where you ended up. That because I'm trying to sort of understand the ways in which, on the one hand, this is a talk about Krakow. On the other hand, it's a talk about the ways in which construction, design, and reception come together in these intersecting ways to understand scale in a way that is particularly opened up in the digital humanities. And on the other hand, this is specifically about a kind of spatial history of ghettoization, right? And the way in which labor and segregation come together, I think, right?
Yeah.
So given that this sort of very ambitious talk is trying to sort of say something about the digital humanities and about Krakow and about the urban planning and spatiality, as it were, and ghettoization, I suppose one question that I would have for you is, given that we do think about the ghetto as a spatialized, as something spatialized as well as something racialized, and also to do, to some extent with labor. I mean, I know that the etymology of ghetto is always sort of under question, and does it replace the foundry in Venice, or is it the foundry, as it were? So I suppose one way of asking this question is, I know that so much work has been done on digital humanities in the space of Venice. Could you say something about what's at stake in the different forms of intersection in different historical periods when you're comparing, say, the ghetto in Venice and the specific scene that you have given us in Krakow?
Well, you see, you throw the big question at me. But what I like about that is also that you've recognized what I am attempting to do here, which is to kind of bring to juggle three balls in the air and to think about three communities: an art historical community, a digital humanities community, and also a genocide studies community. And three terms that aren't always or rarely brought together. And what I do like also where you ended there is the question of what's at stake. I think that what's at stake is that it really, and whether we're talking about other forms of ghettoization, such as Venice, or whether talking about other forms of genocide, I think that what I'm trying to do here and what's really at stake is that very old humanities question of connecting the individual to the systemic, right? It perhaps is one of the oldest of humanities questions, and it's something that especially in art history and the social history of art has troubled us, because inevitably we would see a painting or a building and we're trying to think about it as as how does that society help us to explain that building? But in some ways, I'm interested in reversing that and saying, how does looking at these nodes, how does the building site, so that's really my core here, how does the building site point to what's at stake? And the building site points to me at what's at stake for the individual and the systemic. And I think that to me is really the issue of what's at stake is how do we not lose sight of both the individual and the systemic at the same time? So how do we do a political economy of our world at the same time value subjectivity and experience? And I don't know how successful that is, but I think it at least begins to put those things in relationship to each other in a way that is more analytical. And I think so. And especially when one talks about the Holocaust, it inevitably pushes one way or the other. So you have wonderful work by someone like Adam Tuza, who works on the wages of destruction, the whole system of military occupation. And then on the other hand, you have a really wonderful work on survivor testimony, or on individual architects and painters that really drills down into this the specific experience of, say, Frieda Dickel-Brandeis in Theresienstadt. She was an artist. And we tend to keep splitting that way. And I would say that we split that way in almost every cultural moment in which we're looking at real oppression, where culture and oppression come together. It tends to bifurcate. And so I guess I want to, what's at stake is keeping them in relationship to each other. So thank you for that question, because I actually hadn't articulated that before in my mind, and quite that way. And so I'll leave it at that. So.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. So we have a question from Sylvia. From Sylvia Miller. Could you interpret in more detail the 3 photos in your last slide? And it's also in your first slide, I think, right?
Yeah.
Who are the 3 women in the photograph on the right? Are they members of the German elite?
Oh, apologies if that wasn't clear from my caption. No. That's actually that's like a very sad photograph. It's from Helena Nelken's published diary. And it's Helena Nelken with 2 of her friends. And why it's a sad photograph, it was taken 2 days before occupation, and she was there visiting the Wawel. So the reason I thought that was quite evocative, that was an evocative photo for me, because it was her experience of the Wawel. And the photograph on the left was just a construction site photo when they were building the administration building. It's from around 1942. And then the photo in the middle was the model of the construction building as it was produced by the architects. So you had it was the Wawel in three different relationships. And again, 3 different modes of photography as well. One which is site construction, kind of a documentary. The other which is presentational, that is the design. And then the third, which is touristic, which is 3 teenage girls having a lovely day off. So those 3 kind of modes of photography are all of the same site. And actually it gets back to your question, Ranji, is that the site itself is what produces the relationship, but it's by no means collapses them. Indeed, they are 3 different modes of photographing. So.
Thank you. So another question is, did the straightening of the river also put the ghetto on the wrong side of the river, as it were, sort of the way many towns in the US have a so-called wrong side of the railroad tracks?
Yeah. I mean, certainly the interesting thing is, I mean, the district of Pogorza, it wasn't all run down. Actually, Helena Nelken and her family lived south of the river, although they lived further to the west. That is before ghettoization. So it wasn't all run down, but the particular area that was isolated for the ghetto was particularly run down. It was a 19th century site that had become a kind of working class district. It was near railroad tracks, near some industrial sites as well. But the good question there is that another aspect of the plan was not only changing the Vistula, but there was the canal. And that canal was very much, it was productive. It was meant to help to bring industry to the Vistula, which was meant to be a working river, still is a working river, I should say. But it was also meant as a separation. It was certainly meant as a border. Essentially, everything south of the canal and the river became not officially, but by act, SS property. So the SS controlled that whole area. So the ghetto was controlled by the SS, but also right south of the ghetto, that's where you have the labor camp of Plaszow, which then became the concentration camp Plaszow. So essentially that was an SS district that was separate from the administrative district to the north, which was also the historic district. So you're going to have residential to the left, administrative to the right, and then SS and punitive to the south.
Thank you. Thanks. Just as a reminder, please do put your questions in the Q&A. Something just jumped there. Sorry, no, something just disappeared, I think. Hopefully it will come back. So I suppose I want to sort of push you, Paul, on articulating again what the distinction is between what is afforded in analogical methods, the distinct and digital ones in this kind of mapping that you've given us. You said it was particularly at that point in your talk, I think, where you turned to the question of the relationship of the flow of movement basically to the ghetto, and you said that there had been, or I think, or that there were analog modes through which this has been understood and discussed. So I was just wondering if you could talk through what those were again, and then sort of as a way of just clarifying, I suppose, what's enabled by the digital.
Mm-hmm. It's a word I don't think I used. The exploratory, quite common in the digital humanities, of course. I think of the digital and the way that we're using the animation and the maps. They come off as like, oh wow, this Davide's animation is really impressive, and we get a little bit dazzled by some of that possibility, which is good. It's a very nice animation, but it's very hard to communicate how much the digital itself becomes another archive. So I think about it in the sense that we rarely ask someone, it's like, oh, well, you went to an archive in Berlin and in Munich, and we ask about the evidence they use, but we don't say like, wow, was the Berlin archive really different from the Munich archive? And, what did you really learn in Berlin that you didn't learn in Munich? I mean, we could ask those questions, but we don't. We say like, what's the evidence you use? So we jump straight to the evidence and we kind of obscure the archive. In some ways, that's the digital humanities is another archive. It's a way that I understand evidence in a new way. So it's essentially where I learn about my evidence. I did not know the extent of construction forced labor until I saw the map. I didn't, and I've read plenty of archives. I've done, I've done all the ghetto literature that you want me to do, but I just didn't know that. And you knew it anecdotally. Especially when you get down to the individual, someone who you read Julius Feldman's diary. Julius Feldman talks about construction forced labor. You see a testimony. Oh, they talked about carrying bags of cement. But systemically, that's what I didn't know. And the extent of that. And that's really quite profound. That means it's a new source. But like an archive, it's a source, it's not an answer. right? It still requires different kinds of evidence. I've got to go back. I've really got to do the work of looking at the construction industry. There were, for just on the river alone, there were over 30 different firms that were working there, and they were not just German firms, but there was a big Dutch contingent, for example, Danish, excuse me, not Dutch, Danish, and so it's really. Um, uh, it is a new art. It raises new questions, and I just didn't see it. I could not see it from the archival evidence alone. And that's a kind of big question. But there are also smaller ones, such as the straightening of the river. And I really do. If I had looked more closely and thought about it, I would have. I mean, the river is there. It's straightened on the plan, and that's what Davide illustrated. But it was his visual choices to use that kind of bright blue that the river really came out in a way that it doesn't on the plan, where it's a kind of neutral part of the background. It's just one of hundreds of changes they've made to the built environment. So you just and again, you could see it there, but the animation highlighted it in a way that I said, well, wait a minute. And then suddenly I started looking for the river in documents, and suddenly the river shows up in Hans Frank's office diary in a way that is much more prominent than we've really talked about and that scholars have really talked about. And so the river, again, it's not an answer, but the river becomes a means of thinking about political, economic, and social issues in a completely different way. So I guess it's really so that exploratory moment. I get excited about it because I know the excitement that happens when you go to the archive and you find that architectural plan. I remember one of my first great finds in 1990 in the archive in Potsdam was I found a mislabeled architectural plan. So the archive said it was this set of documents from Speer, and it actually turned out to be another set. And I found this drawing, and it was really exciting. And so that kind of excitement of finding that new evidence that really helps you think through your problem, that exploratory moment in the archive is also what the digital does. And like the archive, 90% of what you do in the digital doesn't really help you rethink what you're doing. Just like 90% of the archive is like, well, that's interesting, I'll take a note of it, but it
Yes.
doesn't end up in the final product. So I don't know if that's quite what answering your question, but for me, that exploratory process is something that we really we need to think more about, because we need to think more about even that first map I showed, which is a map of bias. And if digital helps us to realize the bias in our sources in a better way, that's certainly, as a humanist, a really good place to start.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I think that sort of goes some way to answering Alexandra Magra's question around how digital visualization enables new research questions.
Mhm.
So thanks very much for that. So Pedro Lash asks, how do you see this kind of research developing in the current climate in Poland, with rising opposition to dealing with history once again? You mentioned that upcoming exhibition, for example.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that is a difficult question that is being faced by a large number of Holocaust studies scholars. Jan Grabowski, for example, and his team in Canada. So there's been a very famous case. Yes. So for context, for those that don't know, there are current laws by the Polish legislation that have certain kinds of criminal implications or indictment implications, at least, for those that would imply that Polish citizens had something to do with organizing or planning the Holocaust in particular. Although I'm not getting it quite right, but you can look that up. Yeah, I feel that certainly this work is very important in that regard. And one thing that I want to do is I want to make it complicated. I want to make perpetrators complicated. So I want to make sure that we think about, for example, Charlotte Wächter. We think about women in their important role as perpetrators. I want to think about the complexities of the Jewish community. I want to think of the hierarchies that Helena Nelken is quite clear about in her own diary. the social economic hierarchies, gender hierarchies that are playing out, ethnic hierarchies, different groups of the Jewish community themselves, and the way that that's part of survival and it's part of also death. But I also, of course, want to talk about the complexities in the Polish Christian community, and that certainly, that there were tens of thousands of Poles that were conscripted, not quite forced labor, but second to that, conscripted to do work for the German military drive. But there were also people that were willing to do that and profited from that. And there were construction workers involved, and managers and foremen and architects, and you name it, right? As with any occupation. And so I want to make that intersecting history intersecting and complex. I don't really. I think that there are certainly quite a few Polish scholars that are trying to do this kind of work, but they are facing some serious odds right now as it becomes a national debate in a way that we usually don't experience as scholars. So I guess that what I would say is that what my work can do is hopefully support those that are looking for that complex history and are willing to face a complex history that doesn't deny the fact that we're all capable of being victims and perpetrators at the same time. And that we have to see that, and that's part of our human experience. That's certainly something that I hope my work would contribute to and help understand.
Thanks, Paul. Elizabeth Brown has a question about this issue of archive that you've brought up, and I think presents a kind of an interesting idea for you, an interesting term to think through, and that is anti-archive. She says, it seems that you're creating an anti-archive, but I'm not sure if that's the right word. And let me just sort of give you a little bit of a context to how she comes up with that. After thanking you for the fascinating talk, she says, as you build your own archive of the information you're uncovering, how do you conceive of this archive in the sense of does your archive follow the same structural organization of conventional archives, or is it a kind of anti-archive?
Interesting term, right? Thank you for that. I'm immediately cast back to one of my wonderful colleagues, Hannah Jacobs, who's always reminding us to think about structuring our data and to think about metadata and keeping our data organized. She's really quite wonderful at that. And I think that I guess one of my responses would be that the team, this broader historical GIS of the Ghettos team, led by Ann Knowles, we spent. Let me get this right. We spent a year and a half worrying and thinking about the kind of evidence we were going to extract in the first pass of the Ghettos Encyclopedia. So there are over 1,000 ghettos. So it's this massive tome, and that was our archive, right? And we had to extract from that. And what were we going to extract? How did we extract? And where is the ambiguity? How do we deal with ambiguity? Dating, for example. The most common thing is someone would say a ghetto was formed in spring of 1941. And then the next entry would be a ghetto was formed on March 3rd of 1941. Well, okay. How do you put a date in your database? So it's a long way of saying that I think for me, some of the most exciting work is actually that construction of the new archive, which becomes then the data set. And what categories are you putting it in? What fields make sense? How do you capture uncertainty? That is all of those things. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that we're making an anti-archive. I would say we're making an extended archive. So for the art historians in the world, we think about Roz Krauss and sculpture in the expanded field, that kind of fundamental approach. So it doesn't mean that it is opposed to the source, but it means that it helps to clarify the source and puts the source in and makes a new source out of that. So I think expanding an expanded field of archives is probably a better way of thinking about it. But certainly what I would emphasize is that you're quite right to point to that, because as anybody who does a digital humanities project knows, well, actually, it's like writing a book, right? 6 years out of 8 years are about that research work, and then the 2 years are about the writing. And so, that's kind of where I am in my book chronologies. And the two, but what you see is the writing, and you don't see that 6 years of parsing and going the wrong direction and putting things in categories and filing away. And so I think that what's exciting actually sometimes for the humanist and the digital humanities is actually having those year-long conversations in which you decide what does labor mean in ghettoization? And we had long conversations about what is labor. And that seems like an easy question, but actually it took quite a bit of work to figure that one out.
Right. Thank you. So there's we're almost at time, but maybe I can just sort of squeeze one more in, if that's okay. There's a question from Katja Riegler. Do you think that the results of this project would have turned out similar or quite different if, for example, if the example wasn't Krakow but Warsaw, or a site outside of Poland, even differently phrased, is the unique position of Krakow as a town with a ghetto crucial for the argument?
Right. What I like about that is it kind of skewers the question of systemic, right? So that's your point, puts the finger in the wound there in an interesting way. I mean, I was drawn to Krakow for clear reasons. One is by the literature of people like Perpetrators and others who, so, we've known about the Ritter Plan for a while. Also, I have to say the Ritter documents are in Munich, which is a place I go to frequently in terms of my own research. So that was one of the first things I was able to see when I started this project some years ago. So Krakow, and I was intrigued by Krakow, of course, also because of this duality of this major Nazi building plan, at the same time a major ghetto and a major camp. So and again, that is truly unique.
Mm-hmm.
But does that therefore skew it? That's a really interesting question. I would certainly argue that we can, going back to Ranji's first question, we can think about the broader question of genocide and experience as it is seen relationally to building. That's certainly not something unique to Krakow. I've been to several historic plantation sites in North Carolina in which this is obviously something that is also quite evident. That is the forced labor, the enslaved labor of Africans, the political economic goals of the white patrons, all at the same space. And we use the space as it is used by American historians and art historians, use the space to kind of explode those relationships and critique that kind of architectural history. So in that sense, I don't think that the method is certainly unique to Krakow, or the questions, I guess, the relational questions are not unique to Krakow. That said, you're certainly right that I need to think about how exceptional Krakow is and whether that needs to be couched in some different terms. Warsaw, a very different situation, and Warsaw, as is well known, of course, Warsaw was meant to be leveled. And in fact, it was leveled just because from the German point of view, that was the worst of Polish cities. And it was just going to be reduced to nothing and made into a village. So that Polish past would be erased from Central Europe.
Right. Paul, thank you so much for this, and thank you so much for your the wonderful talk, but also the very thoughtful responses to questions. There are more questions. I'm going to ask Jennifer to copy the questions for you and send them to you. So
Thank you.
so you have them, and then I'm sure that you can respond appropriately. I want to thank everyone here for coming this morning and spending your Friday morning or whatever time it is, wherever you are, with us. And please do join us next week for another TGI FHI. But let's just, I know that you can't actually do this from where you are, but on behalf of all of you, I am going to applaud Paul and thank you again very much, Paul, for this wonderful talk.
Well, thank you, Ranji, and thanks everybody for coming.